everyone, and welcome to this short video focusing on open source, fast track to AI success. My name is Natalia Modjeska. I'm Research Director and Practice Lead for Artificial Intelligence at Omdia. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Joe Fernandez, Vice President and General Manager for AI Business Unit at Red Hat. Joe, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I think these times have never been better or easier for building enterprise AI applications. There's so many different tools to choose from, so many APIs, so many different models, both open source and proprietary. And obviously, organizations experiment with both of them. That's what we hear from our surveys. And there are pros and cons for either option. So we hear that cost is pretty high, on the agenda for organizations experimenting with AI, especially those experimenting with generative AI.
Yeah.
And also those who are kind of a little bit more mature in adopting AI, and those who are scaling, moving from proof of concept to production. Is that also what you see? What are some of the difficulties? What can you tell us about how organizations are managing the rising cost of generative AI, especially, like I said, when they're moving kind of more proof concept projects into production?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, generative AI is very powerful, and every customer we talk to at least is in the pilot or proof of concept phase, but many of them are accelerating deployments out to production. A lot of them, as you mentioned, they'll start with the API-based cloud services, and the challenge then is as you move out to production, now you're running those use cases at scale, right? And then generally those are followed by additional use cases. That's really where the costs start to add up, right? So you start annualizing those costs and then multiplying them by the number of use cases, and it becomes a challenge for a lot of customers because to get an ROI, you really need to overcome the cost barrier and so forth. And so, I mean, I think step one for a lot of customers is just understanding that transition and what this is going to cost them at scale, and then being able to sort of build that business case for themselves and for their business on how they'll be able to manage that. Because at the end of the day, we see more and more use cases coming down the path. But the cost, because of the high cost of GPU infrastructure, the cost of these model services, it can be really a difficult challenge for many customers.
So let's dive in maybe a little bit deeper. So what can customers do? How can they keep better track of the costs that they're accumulating through development and deployment phases, and how can they better manage them?
Yeah. So the nice part is that, as you mentioned, the open source innovation has really become a big factor here, right? So today you don't just have a choice of a few, generative AI cloud services. You also have a large and growing set of open source models that you can deploy yourselves, right? And those models can be sized to fit the use case, from small, 1 billion to 10 billion parameter models to much larger models, right? And so, we firmly believe, there's not going to be one model to rule them all, right? There's going to be lots of different models that are the best fit from both a functionality and a cost perspective for different use cases. So I think, given, the model is central to the generative AI use case, and the size of the model and it really translates then directly to the cost. I think exploring that aspect is certainly one way that folks can dig into this, right? Am I using the most efficient model for my use case? Then it's like, okay, at inference time, we can always also leverage techniques like quantization, right, and compression to basically run those same models more efficiently, right? And so that's another thing that Red Hat invests a lot in, is model compression technology to give folks, maintain accuracy while giving them a lower cost per token by leveraging a smaller version of that model. And then I already mentioned about small language models. A lot of use cases are very specific, and you don't need like 100 billion or a trillion parameter model if you're targeting it to a specific use case. So the growth in small language models, sub 10 billion parameters that are domain specific and trained or tuned for specific use cases, another trend. And then lastly, thinking about where you're running this, right? Like you don't need to just rely on AI services, right? You can leverage GPU infrastructure in the cloud. You can, leverage GPU infrastructure on premise. That may be something that is required for certain use cases that can only live on premise or have to run at the edge. So looking at that, and then, the growing choice in infrastructure providers, right? So NVIDIA is still dominant, but there are other providers, AMD, Intel, and so forth, that are bringing solutions to market. So kind of looking at that aspect as well. So those are just a few of the things, but there's a lot of different ways to sort of look at cost. And I think folks, the more educated you are at the options and the more you tailor the options to your use case, I think the better the outcome will be in the end.
Yeah, so quite a few things here. Choose the right model, match it to the use cases. Also, choose the right environment to write your applications in. So
Right.
you actually brought up a question of a way to run the model and infrastructure. And traditionally, people think of Red Hat as open source, naturally so. In our surveys of practitioners of generative AI and AI in general, lots of them say they choose open source AI over proprietary models based on the perception that they're cheaper, where we started our conversation. But because you brought in the infrastructure, so when you factor in that cost of infrastructure, what are you seeing? Is it really cheaper, that much cheaper?
Yeah, again, I hate to say it, it depends, but like, again, we need to look at, specific use cases, right? Because again, there is the model is a big factor and sizing the model to the use case and trying to run that model in the most efficient way possible. The infrastructure, right? Like this is where Red Hat made our business, right? Is helping our enterprise customers evolve from proprietary infrastructure to open source infrastructure built based on Linux and open source technologies. Kubernetes is another example. Um, at that infrastructure layer, there's just a lot of innovation, right? Most models are generative AI models leveraging things like PyTorch libraries to run the models. We're heavily invested in VLM, which is an open source inference server that is become sort of almost the de facto standard for inference on the open source side. Um, and then leveraging our work in things like inference and PyTorch and kernels and so forth to enable a broader set of hardware providers, right? Because ultimately, again, just like Red Hat's heritage, right? Linux made it possible for customers to run enterprise applications on their choice of x86 infrastructure OEM providers. Today, the competition is at the hardware layer, right? So if we can enable customers to have more choices in terms of the infrastructure that they leverage for inference, for training, and so forth, again, that choice alone brings down the cost, and maybe over time, but like I think this is not a 1 or 2 year phenomena, right? Like we're in this for the long haul, and customers are going to continue growing their use cases and their deployments over time. So yeah, so those are some of the things we're working on and looking at.
Agreed. So something we haven't touched upon yet, and that's something you can't do AI without either. It's data, right?
Mhm.
And when you think about integrating private enterprise data into AI models, that could be quite expensive too. It's another challenge.
Right.
So what do you think? How can this challenge be addressed?
Yeah, so Red Hat, we're really in the enterprise business, which means like enterprise AI, right? We're not trying to build consumer AI services like we won't be building the next Chat GPT or search application. But there's a ton of enterprise AI use cases, and as you rightly mentioned, enterprise use cases, they'll leverage generative AI models, but then those models need to be connected to enterprise data that's usually private or proprietary data that is not out in the public domain. Um, Generally, most customers will start integrating that. Well, you'll start with the data that's in the model, right? So prompting, prompt engineering, prompt tuning, that's where everybody begins. Once you realize you need additional data, retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, is kind of the next place we see customers going. And just in the RAG space, there's everything from just basic RAG scenarios to graph RAG to now agentic RAG, right? There's ways to tune your RAG environment to get more accuracy and to get better access to data. Um, However, like eventually you realize with RAG, you're continuing to accumulate data outside the model. And so then the question is like, well, what if we could make the model more aware of my data, make the model smarter? And that's where we get into fine tuning, right? And generally there's different fine tuning solutions on the market. Some more easier to use than others. What we focus on with our InstructLab fine tuning solution is making fine tuning accessible, but also making it able to customize models with your data, right? So adding your own knowledge or skills to, in particular, these small language models so that you can make them domain specific. And then using that together with RAG, so using a tuned model together with a RAG vector database to really boost that performance so that you can get like big model performance from small domain specific models, which ultimately, again, is about reducing the cost of inference when you deploy those models to production.
This was Natalia Modjeska, Research Director and Practice Lead at Omdia, with Joe Fernandez, Vice President and General Manager for AI Business Unit at Red Hat. And we were talking about open source, fast track to AI success.
All right. Well, thank you again for having me, and happy to do it again anytime.